There's a lot to talk about when it comes to Sonic the Hedgehog, but by far one of the most prevalent topics is how realistic should Sonic be? And does he have games that went too far? Let's discuss all the details right now. Hello there beautiful human, my name is RidersDX and welcome to my channel where today we're going to be talking about a really prevalent Sonic topic here like I said, which is how realistic should Sonic games be? Because there's always been this debate about whether or not Sonic should be more cartoony or should he be more realistic. I mean, we've seen both extremes in the Sonic franchise, so it's kind of come down to what fits Sonic best, and should he stay consistent to it or should he continue being diverse with it. It's a really bloated topic and I just kind of want to take a quick broad look at that, especially at the more realistic games in particular, because Sonic Frontiers is sort of bringing up this debate again. Because if you looked at the footage of Sonic Frontiers, there's something very different about it compared to the games we've been getting for the last 10 years. You see, Sonic Frontiers sports more realistic graphics and seems to be completely absent of Green Hill Zone and all those other levels we come to know and love at this point. So it just seems like it's a bit of a return back to when Sonic was trying to become more realistic, and people have very mixed opinions about it. I mean, there's so many things you could talk about when it comes to Sonic Frontiers, but I think the graphical style of it is definitely one of those big hot topics, and I sort of just wanted to give my input on it, like whether I think this game is looking to be too realistic, or if I think it's the perfect amount, or if I think it's not realistic enough. I mean, there's so many different opinions being thrown out there. Just want to sort of talk about that. So before we really get into it, I think we have to establish where Sonic came from, what he started out as, so that we can get a better sense of whether or not this is too far from the Sonic brand or if it fits just right into the Sonic brand. If we look back at the classic Genesis games, the areas in those games definitely went more towards the wacky and zany side, but I would argue that they were also very much connected to some real life ideas. So one of the things that they really emphasize in the classic Genesis games is the industrialization of the world, because with Sonic, it was all about promoting nature and promoting the preservation of it. And Dr. Roboto is basically the antithesis of that, where he was trying to roboticize every single thing within Sonic's world. And so that is very much a real life issue here, and it helped tie Sonic down to some kind of realism that not many other franchises would even make an effort to do. And so I really think that even though the classic Genesis games had these wacky environments, one, it was basically the only thing you could do with graphics back then. You couldn't make things really realistic. And two, they did make sure that Sonic was tied to some kind of realistic idea and concept that would really help to promote the Sonic brand. And so I do think there's always an element of realism within Sonic, at least compared to his counterparts. I mean, Mario definitely didn't have that same connection, despite maybe him being a plumber and such, and that's about it. But Sonic really did try to keep that connection alive, and that leads us into the adventure games, where they definitely took the realism up to a huge level. And so these games took place in a more urbanized environment with humans walking around and such. And I'm definitely biased when it comes to this opinion, but I definitely love this setting and I love this atmosphere that the adventure games were placed in. I just love seeing Sonic interact in a real life setting. The reason for that is it sort of feels like this appeal that a lot of different movies have, such as, you know, Spider-Man for instance, or any kind of Marvel and DC superhero movie where you had these big extraterrestrial heroes just roaming around in this normal environment. There's just something really appealing about the idea of a superhero protecting you from any kinds of danger whatsoever, and doing it with a smile, cracking jokes here and there, you know, just being a really inspiring figure for kids all around. That's something that the Marvel and DC movies do a really good job at, and it's also something that I think Sonic did a really good job at, especially in the adventure games, because I still recall that iconic first cutscene in Sonic Adventure where Sonic is on top of the building and he's overseeing the police officers doing their thing and just kind of making sure that the town was okay. There was just something so cool about that, so cool about Sonic overseeing the town, protecting it with his own abilities and such. It was just this appeal to Sonic that further tied him into that realism idea, but also still kept that wacky atmosphere to him, because he is a cartoon character, so he does need to be a little bit wacky, a little bit cartoony to an extent, but having that tied realism really helps to balance out the character and the world, and I just felt like the adventure games did a really good job at that. And I felt like they did a perfect balance between realism and a more fictional space. It personally helped me connect deeper to the character and the universe, and I'm still such a big fan of it to this very day. Now moving on though, there are some other games that came out after the adventure games that a lot of people would argue were too realistic, that they went too far, and those games are none other than Shadow the Hedgehog and Sonic 06. So in my honest opinion, and this is definitely not going to make a lot of sense to a lot of people at first, but I actually don't consider these games that much more realistic than the adventure games, and there's a big reason for that. Because if you looked around in terms of the environments and such, there really wasn't a big difference there, you know? Sure, Shadow the Hedgehog had guns, but there were guns in the adventure games, you just didn't utilize them. Well, arguably you did utilize them because you were playing those mech shooting levels and you did use guns in there. It just wasn't a rifle that you were shooting with your hand, it was literally just something attached to the machine, which I guess you could argue is more cartoony, but that's another debate for another day. But there were guns, like you had the soldiers there, had police officers, and you even had bullets being shot at Chaos in the very first cutscene of Sonic Adventure. So it's not like these ideas weren't there before. I think what makes these two games seem more realistic than the other two is really just the tone of the games, because the adventure games sported a more balanced tone that was filled with both humor and intensity, but Shadow and 06 were basically completely void of any kind of humor, and if there was any humor, it felt out of place because the rest of the story was so serious and just gothy, I guess. I know that's not a real word, but basically I was just trying to explain that these stories just felt so depressing and so serious and just taking itself a little bit too seriously. And thus I think that's where the two realistic things really start to arise, because they sort of lost the essence of who Sonic is, lost the appeal of that Sonic, you know, traveling through a realistic environment and being a charming hero and adding some humor and fun to him. That's something that I really think Sonic should always maintain no matter what, and he did do that in Shadow the Hedgehog, but not in Sonic 06. Of course though, Shadow the Hedgehog was centered on Shadow, who was completely devoid of any kind of humor basically, and so that didn't really make much of a difference. So that's why I think these two games came off a little bit more differently compared to adventure games, because it was all about the tone. The tone made it seem much more realistic and tied to reality, when in fact I think Sonic is great when he's tied to a little bit of reality, but he can't go all the way, because you can't play Sonic in a Call of Duty like game and expect it to be successful. Like, it's just not gonna work. Sonic should have that balance between realism and cartooniness, and I felt like the adventure games did a really good job of establishing that balance. Another game that I think did a really good job as well, but a little bit more on the cartoony side, was Unleashed, because Unleashed did have some realistic elements to it. It was a little more cartoony, but I still like the fact that you could hang around with humans, go to environments based off real life locations, and it really did have that same appeal nonetheless. And so that's why I think Shadow and Sonic 06 actually are about as realistic as the adventure games. It's just, it was the tone that made a huge difference there. And so I think we established that, in my opinion, realism in Sonic games does work if there's a certain balance to it. And that appeal of Sonic traveling amongst humans and being a savior is really appealing as well, and something that I really hope to keep seeing in future Sonic games and media. Now when we're talking about Sonic Frontiers though, Sonic Frontiers is something that's going to be really interesting to keep track of, because visual wise, the only reason this game appears to be more realistic than previous games is because of how much more advanced graphics are compared to back then. I mean, you have to think about the fact that it's been 15 years since we had Sonic 06, which is what I consider to be the last truly realistic Sonic game. And Sonic 06 looked really realistic back then, but nowadays it seems like it's something that does fit Sonic pretty well. So if you put Frontiers around that same time period, I'm sure it would look very similar to Sonic 06. Even that first trailer where you see Sonic running through the fields, it would look very similar to that. So I would admit, I was even taken aback by the excessive amount of ruins and such. It just seemed like something that was a little bit out of place for Sonic, but a couple reasons for that is because, one, again, the graphics are much more advanced than they used to be, and two, it's also just been a long time since we've seen Sonic in an environment like this. but technically ruins have always been a part of Sonic lore, even back in the original Genesis titles, so the graphics really just are much more advanced compared to before, and that's why they look more realistic. You know, Sonic Team is just adding more details because they have the technology to do it, and so, you know, that's a natural progression for Sonic, and as a result of this game's direction, that's why it feels more realistic. One thing that I'm really curious about though is that based on what I said about the appeal of realism in Sonic games, the way Sonic Frontiers is being set up, that's actually going to be absent here. So, like I said, one of the biggest reasons I really like the realism in Sonic games is because he's traveling throughout a human environment and it's coming off as this like superhero figure to people across town. But this game seems to be taking place on Starfall Islands, which seems completely barren and absent of any kind of life. And so this is going to be very interesting for me because you're taking away that appeal for me personally in realistic games and doing something completely different with it. And so I'm not really sure if Sonic Frontiers will be successful and be a more realistic experience because it's tackling it from a different angle compared to what Sonic's done before. So that's why this game still feels a little bit of a wild card in terms of whether or not the realism will work. However, I do know that Ian Flynn is heading the script for this one, so I think we could be in for a great narrative that may review a brand new appeal for Sonic in more realistic environments. You know, if Ian Flynn manages to create a lore and a narrative that is still engaging despite the absence of that appeal that's made Sonic in realistic environments great in the past, then I think that would be a great accomplishment and just shows the diversity and range of Sonic games. You could argue that Sonic should have a more consistent identity because, you know, that's how you keep branding consistent and that's how you make sure that people that are fans of the series will continue to be fans of the series because it will keep a consistent look to it. But honestly, I think that's one of the appeals of Sonic games for me personally is because you never know what to expect going into the next Sonic game. It's always going to be something completely different, and I just think that's exciting and also nerve-wracking because you want it to be good. You want it to be good so bad. But like I said, as long as they keep that integral characteristic of Sonic, which is him being a light-hearted, fun guy, but taking things seriously when he needs to, I think that this game will work in terms of its narrative, and I think the realism will suit Sonic as long as that balance is maintained. But we'll just have to see because it looks like Sonic will be primarily by himself in this adventure, so it could very easily become a boring realistic approach, kind of like 06 and Shadow. But hopefully Ian Flynn knows what he's doing and he is sure to keep that balance alive, even if you have this slightly different setup from what we're used to. But that's pretty much everything I had in terms of whether or not I think Sonic games are too realistic. I think the adventure games strike a perfect balance in that, and I think Sonic just went a little bit too realistic in some of his future titles, and then went a little too far in the other direction in other titles. And so, let me know your thoughts. Do you think Sonic games have been too realistic in the past, or do you think they've not been realistic enough? Let me know why not in the comments. I'd be really curious, and just let me know your overall thoughts on Sonic Frontiers now that we've had some time to sit with it. What do you think of it now? Are you still excited for it, or is there anything you're concerned about? Let me know all those thoughts, and just, yeah, you all have some good holidays, okay? This is Riders, riding out. Thank you so much for watching this video. Special shout out to my patrons, New Gamer Hub, Team Rattle Sign Gamer, Johnny Hinton Ortiz, Trash Q, Claw84. These are my patrons / YouTube members. If you'd like to become a patron or YouTube member and get access to a whole bunch of different perks, then please check out the links in the description box below. But alright, this is Riders, riding out.